There exists an ancient land where everything in it, from living things to inanimate objects, have their own kami, or spirit. Its history is teeming with cautionary tales of restless spirits, demons and gods roaming about here, many malevolent and vengeful, doomed to finish some task binding them to this world. These are just some of the stories of the demons of Japan, one of the most haunted places on Earth. A gigantic shadow looms over the center of the island nation, like a mighty titan watching over its domain. The origin of Mount Fuji tells like a ghost story, and seems to have arrived more like a living being rather than forming over time. The myth tells of a strange cataclysmic event that foreshadowed its mysterious appearance. But some myths are so old that their origin cannot be accounted for. Such is the case with Mount Fuji. Our folkloric tale begins in prehistoric Japan. One night, a woodsman named Visu was awakened by a booming noise, seemingly coming from deep within the earth beneath, as the ground shook violently. In a panic, he gathered up his family and planned to flee far from the area. But upon reaching his doorway, he was struck with awe at the colossal sight before him. The flat plains of the area that he knew so well were now gone, consumed by the looming shadow of a gargantuan mountain that had sprung forth from the earth. Fuji had claimed its place of abode in a single day, according to this legend. Geologists believe that Fuji formed around 8500 BC, and this story is only traced back to the 1st century BC. But some believe this tale could be the surviving remnant of an eyewitness account. And Visu named this newborn giant Fujiyama, meaning the never-dying mountain. It has been a sacred place of awe and strange occurrences ever since. Its peak is said to have been the home to the goddess Senjin, who dwelled inside a luminous cloud in the mountain's crater. Religious pilgrimages used to take place, leading wary sojourners to her temple near the peak. This mountain of gods, sacred to the Japanese, has had several volcanic events, and it's believed that 1,200 years ago, lava covered the northwestern flank of the mountain. But today a dense forest has grown out of the volcanic soil, and this place is regarded as one of the most haunted places in Japan. Known as the Sea of Trees, Aokigahara Forest is an eerily quiet place where sunlight hardly penetrates its darkness. Because of its seclusion, it is said to have been a place to leave the elderly and infirmed in ancient times. The practice was called ubasute, meaning abandoning an old woman, and is only legend, but countless ancestors were thought to have been brought here to die. And unfortunately, many today wander here alone to end their lives, earning it an infamous nickname in the Western world. The Japanese government finds dozens of people every spring when the forest reopens, and have stopped reporting the numbers to discourage anyone from attempting to end it all at this place. According to folklore and eyewitness accounts, this Sea of Trees is home to the Yuri. According to Japanese beliefs, these are the spirits that are cursed with a permanent and restless existence on our earthly plane in death. They roam about as vengeful spirits, trapped in the tragic states they were in their previous lives. Being the Japanese equivalent to ghosts, the name Yuri is the joining of two kanji, or words, faint or dim, and spirits or souls. The Shinto religion states that when a person dies, they enter a sort of purgatory and wait for the proper rituals to be performed. before it can finally cross over. But if these rites are not performed properly, the path of the spirit is disrupted and it cannot join the ancestors. Worse yet, if the person dies a violent or painful death at someone else's hand, or even their own, the Yuri can become tied down and can haunt a place until its turmoil somehow is resolved. An untold number of these spirits are said to inhabit Ogiwara forest, that eerily silent realm at the base of the mighty Mount Fuji, and many choose to die here because they feel they are not alone among the restless spirits trapped here. There are many legends of these spirits and their terrifying and confusing contact with the living. In the southwest region of Japan lies Himeji Castle, and nearby on the grounds is a well that is the subject of a tragic haunting. In the mid-17th century, this castle's master was a samurai, Eyama Tasan, who had many servants, one being a beautiful young girl named Okiku. Eyama fell in love with the girl, but his affection was never reciprocated. Desperate to have her for himself, he hid one of 10 expensive plates and blamed her for the theft, promising not to punish her if she became his lover. But she was defiant and absolutely refused. His rage and jealousy at this perceived insult proved to be immense. The castle master then tortured the young girl before throwing her into the large well. But her death would not be the end of Okiku's story. People began seeing the apparition of the beautiful servant rising from the black well, and she could be heard counting the plates one at a time. But when reaching 9 and unable to find the 10th, she would emit a terrifying shriek, unsettling any who heard it. An additional folktale tells that a man once witnessed this counting for himself, and when she reached 9, he yelled out 10, and the spirit reportedly returned to the well in silence, possibly thinking that someone had found the missing plate. And many of the people here believe that the spirit was appeased, but some still say they hear her sad and desperate cries in the night to this day. These old stories are often marked by tragedy, and in the case of one of my favorite ghost stories, there's an underlying warning against chasing selfish ends. This is the story of the Selfseeking Samurai. Back during the time when Kyoto was still the capital city of Japan, there was a samurai who suffered devastating financial loss to his employer, the daimyo of the province. He then sought employment in another province, and although his wife was a good woman, he thought it wise to start a completely new life and abandoned her. And over the years, in this new land, the samurai began regaining his wealth and former success, and decided to take a new wife, but this marriage turned out to be a loveless one, with no children. As more years passed, his wealth grew tremendously, and he began to think of his first wife often, realizing he had really loved her deeply, and he soon decided to make his way back to his old home in search of his lost love. And in doing this, he was abandoning his second wife, again seeking his own self-absorbed goal. Upon entering the capital, his old hometown, he reminisced of past times as he made his way to his old home, and there, he saw his first wife, looking quite the same as she did in their youth, despite having been many years ago. The samurai begged her to forgive him for his desertion and selfishness, and without hesitation, she forgave him and spoke of how much she had always loved him. They then talked all through the night, seemingly picking up where they had left off so long ago, eventually retiring to the bedroom to make love. The samurai woke in the morning to turn to his wife and was horrified at what was laying before him. His beautiful bride was a withered corpse, sitting motionless on the bed next to him. He later discovered that after he had left his wife years ago, she lived alone in their house for a few months before dying of a broken heart. The samurai had been unknowingly appealing to her ghost. But beyond all the ancient ghost stories, modern-day Japan is still deeply superstitious, and there is no shortage of documented encounters with the dead. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan claimed nearly 20,000 lives, and in the weeks and months following this tragedy, survivors began reporting encounters with tsunami spirits. A sociology graduate named Yuka Kudo began writing a paper shortly after the tsunami struck. She was fascinated by interviews with the cab drivers in the region, who were convinced they had given rides to ghosts. Of the many she interviewed, 7 came forward to share their bizarre and hair-raising experiences. One of the cab drivers recounted his experience. He picked up a young man who looked to be about 20 years old, wearing a thick coat. As he got into the taxi, the driver felt unease and somehow felt that there was something strange about his passenger. The sun was setting, and as they pulled up to the destination, the driver glanced back to see an empty back seat. He had disappeared. Another even creepier event happened just a few months after the tsunami. A cab driver picked up a woman who got into the vehicle and asked to be taken to the Miyagi district. But this shook the driver a bit, as he explained the entire Miyagi region had been wiped out and destroyed by the waves. This strange woman then turned to him and asked, "Have I died?" Yuka, the student who conducted these interviews, turned them into her professor, and he concluded that they could be forms of PTSD resulting from the tragedy. But the cab drivers insist that their experiences were real and not hallucinations of any kind. It would be difficult to attribute a psych disorder to one of the most disturbing anomalies surrounding the tsunami: the supposed cases of ghost possession. In his book, Ghosts of the Tsunami, Death and Life in Japan's Disaster, Richard Lloyd Perry cites the experiences of Takashi Ono. His real name has been swapped with a pseudonym to protect his identity. Takashi, who lived miles away from the devastated areas, decided to drive to the beach to see the damage for himself. But he was shocked and sickened by the destruction, and his possession started that very night. As he returned home, he had a meal with his family and had his cup of tea and can of beer, his usual nightly routine. But suddenly he began rolling around on the ground, making animal noises, and running outside to roll in the mud, as his wife and mother witnessed this in horror. When he woke the next day, he had no memory of the night before. As these episodes kept happening for 3 days, he would speak in a strange guttural way, threatening violence and talking about the dead. His family finally convinced him to see a Buddhist priest to drive out the spirits, and soon after the priest recited the sutras, the man began feeling better. But what can we make of these events? Are they a remnant of generational superstitions, a sort of feedback loop of psychosomatic suggestion? Or are they just a continuation of real demonic activity that's taken place here before history ever began? Japanese ghost stories are among some of the most fascinating. The land of the rising sun has superstition and fear of the dead deeply ingrained within it. The following are 3 Japanese tales of demons, curses, madness, and mountain spirits that have traveled generations, being told over candlelight and campfires. And now, I bring them to you. long time ago, there lived a recently widowed man by the name of Ogiwara. He was wandering the streets on the first night of the Obon festival. Obon is a Japanese Buddhist holiday spent revering and honoring ancestors and family spirits, as the ghosts are expected to return and walk the earth. As the widower traversed the festival, he crossed paths with a beautiful woman and her servant. She carried an ornate lantern with a peony flower symbol on it. Ogiwara was drawn to her and invited her into his home. Her name was Atsuyu, and they quickly became physically intimate, and she stayed with him all night until early morning, when she left suddenly but reluctantly. Ogiwara, not knowing if he'd see her again, spent the day fearing that he would not, but the following evening, the beauty returned with her servant, carrying the same flower lantern. From that point, he fell deeply in love with Atsuyu, but this began to strangely affect him. He stopped leaving his home and did little to take care of himself, as the beautiful woman visited him every night continually, but still left around dawn. After 20 days of this, Ogiwara's neighbor, a wise old man, had noticed his strange reclusive behavior, and one night, hearing laughing and singing coming from his house, he peered through a hole in the wall. The old man was horrified at what he saw and heard. Ogiwara was embracing a skeleton, and upon taking a better look through the opening, he realized that the bones were not only standing on their own, but when Ogiwara spoke, the skull nodded, and the arms and legs moved about. And when the jaws of the bony figure opened, an otherworldly voice filled the air. At daybreak, he warned Ogiwara that she was a ghost and pleaded with him to cleanse himself of the mysterious spirit at the temple. He followed the old man's advice, but upon reaching the temple, Ogiwara discovered Atsuyu's grave, with her old, tattered flower lantern draped across it. The temple priest gave him a protective charm to ward her off, and it worked well. He was no longer visited in the night. However, Ogiwara became depressed and missed Atsuyu deeply. Only a few days of separation after employing the charm, he got extremely drunk and carelessly wandered to the temple. And at the gates, his ghostly mistress appeared to him as she led him into the graveyard. After Ogiwara went missing, the priest felt compelled to check the grave of Atsuyu, and when the coffin was opened, there laid the body of Ogiwara, embracing her skeleton. This next legend comes from the 13th century. 3 wicked samurai visited the town of Manazuru. Kosanta, Matashigi, and Akaguro. At the time, the town was holding a festival, but they became extremely drunk and started to argue, and the fight became so heated, they drew their swords and managed to behead one another. The severed heads were said to roll into the sea. However, not even death could end their quarrel. The samurai were transformed into Onryo, or wrathful spirits. Their energy became trapped in the realm of the living. And soon after, people began witnessing 3 heads that would float to the surface, that would gnaw and bite at each other, and breathe flames in each other's directions, locked in an eternal argument. They're said to still haunt the sea around the same area and have been seen dancing on the surface as they spew flame and snap at each other. Locals still fear seeing them and avoid any waves grouped in 3s, as it's believed that this is the submerged spirits about to break the surface, bringing extremely bad luck and certain doom to those who see them with their own eyes. The mountains of Japan are vast, lonely places, home to terrifying and hideous creatures. The female mountain spirits, known as the Yama-uba. But this tale involves a spirit that was an exception. She was in some ways beautiful, but also ghastly, giving off a ghostly white glow. She's known as Yuki-onna, the Snow Woman, and she would gently lull travelers to sleep in snowstorms, a sleep from which they never woke from. The ancient story tells of two men, one young and one old, who took refuge in a mountain hut during a blizzard. And in the night, Yuki-onna entered the hut and breathed over the older man, then came to the younger. She told him she would spare his life if he kept her visit a secret. And the old man was dead in the morning, and the terrified young man let it be assumed that he froze to death and made no mention of the spirit. In time, he met a beautiful and gracious young woman named Yuki, meaning snow, but he never made any kind of sinister connection. Yuki was a loving wife and a great mother to the children they had together. One night they sat together in the lantern light, and the white light reflecting on Yuki's face reminded him of his encounter, and he told his wife of the tale of his youth and the Snow Woman who caused his companion's death. Suddenly, Yuki's natural color changed, and she transformed into the form he knew so well from so long ago. Standing before him was the mountain spirit, and in restrained, subtle fury, she reminded her husband of his promise, and that if not for the children, she would have killed him instantly. The two locked in a mutual gaze until she faded away in front of him, abandoning her mortal family, and she was never seen again. If you haven't yet, check out my video on the witch archetype here, or click here for stories from people who were dragged to hell. See you all very, very soon.